Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Today we're redrawing an older drawing of mine, since it is something I haven't exactly done too often before, for reasons we will speak on more later. Though I will say now, this drawing was originally going to be part of another idea too. That idea being to do a set of themed witch drawings for various ideas, and it was actually what led me towards this old drawing to begin with. Yet this one ended up substantial enough to stand as its own video, and it is far more interesting as a drawing to discuss as a redraw, since I did put a lot of focus on that in the end. So without delay, let's just kinda get into it all. The original drawing is the one that is currently on screen at the moment. I did it in November of 2021, according to the files at the very least, since I don't exactly recall when I did it, and I remember being extremely proud of it when I completed it. The original idea was a witch, based on themes of space or the night sky, though I did focus more on the space idea overall, since it was one of those phases where I was really interested in the appearance of space for that moment. This was also around the time that I was getting into digital art as well. It wasn't my first time for it, there being a few years before this where I really first tried it, but this was definitely the start of what got me invested in it so that I still do it today. This also means I was in no concept of the word experienced in it. I do mean that too. I'd been drawing on paper for a few years at this point and enjoying it, and as mentioned, had a brief trial of digital art a little bit before this too, but gave it a break since I struggled to get used to it. This time, after at least a year's gap of never touching digital art since, I had done 2 other character drawings before this one, and had really only just begun understanding what I could do with it that I couldn't on paper. The other 2 drawings were of a witch and another of an elf on a plain background, and they weren't really anything special, but they were fun, and I liked them so I kept going. As I said, I was really happy with this one when I finished it. I think it was one of the first few drawings digitally that I liked and thought worked out how I wanted it to, which kind of broke down the issues that I had been having with it until this point. Until this point, I could only see the flaws and the imperfections since I was struggling with the medium. This idea also gave me the urge to draw more like them, and it is part of why I still do digital art today if I am entirely honest with myself. I went on from this one to draw similar characters for day, dawn, dusk as well, since most people I showed this one read it as the night sky, and I thought it would be fun to complete the set. This time though, I won't be redrawing them, since their images were some that I didn't like even at the time. And I always liked this one more, I always remembered this one more. I knew their designs were lacking or lazy even when I first did the other set, since I wasn't sure what to do for them like I could do for space and night. So why, out of all of my old art, did I choose this one to redraw? Why not the witch that I did before this, or the elf, or just anything else? I think it's because I remember this drawing a lot. This week was originally going to be a character set video, where I designed themed witches on various ideas like nature and water as well. In the idea phase, I noted down space and immediately recalled this drawing and the others I did in relation to them. Outside of it, I remember this drawing when talking to people about art and what I used to draw, and it is an example of something I used to like and be rather proud of. It has its flaws now that I look back at it, yet I was super proud of it, and I showed it to people, and the idea of it made me happy. When I was thinking of ideas for the set of witches, I figured that I would find this drawing in my files as well, since I do have them all stored in various places still. I figured I'd find it just to look at, just to remember it, maybe take some inspiration from it. See, I have older drawings than this one, since my rule for storing them is fairly simple. If I finish the drawing, or see potential in a sketch, I will save it for later somewhere. If I don't, then it's really up to how I feel in that moment, yet the finished drawings will be saved since they may not be good, but they're progress and they're part of the journey. So, I knew that I had this one somewhere, and I felt that for this set, it could inspire me, so I went to find it. I actually found that I had it in more places than I believed. I really forgot where I stored this one, so it seems to be a copy on everything. Now, when I open the file, I then started to see the issues with the piece. It's only natural, really. It was done years ago at this point, and I knew that they existed within it now. And I would have to look around those issues if I wanted to find something to use. This is then where the original idea for the video wavered. As seen at the start, I kind of pick the drawing apart and note down the issues I see with it and what I would want to change from the design points to technical skills. I pick apart the designed bits that are lazy, that just don't make sense, and also bits that are just drawn wrong because I didn't know better. For an example of this, the veil was intended to have things hanging around it, yet, looking back, the patterns look printed on and don't hold much relevance to the overall theme, so they would probably have to change if I did it today. It was this logic that made me realise that I can redraw it. There's nothing really stopping me. I could easily change the design as a sort of marker in terms of progress if I wanted to, and I could include it as part of the Witches set with a note to it that it's a redraw. This, of course, has since changed since this drawing alone became an entire video. I started to put the clips together when taking a break from the drawing before I would go back to it, and I found that I already had over half of this video without being quite near done. It meant I simply changed the topic for the video, saved the other sketches for a later point in time if I still wanted to do something with them, and I focused on using this week as a sort of redrawing video, even though I never thought that I would redraw any of my old stuff. I sort of held myself that I wouldn't. In the beginning of the drawing, I did consider maybe just coming up with new ideas and not making it a redraw or anything, since I often try to avoid doing that for old art. Don't get me wrong, I love watching this sort of video myself. I love seeing how others have improved from their old art, yet I never quite bring myself to redrawing old art myself. I think it's since I don't want to get stuck into trying to always improve past ideas, or getting stuck looking at old art for the flaws. I really don't want to just look back and see the negatives, but see the positives and the fun that I had. And it's kind of why I've never done this before. I mean, don't get me wrong, I liked the older version of the art, and to this day I still like it in my own way. It isn't the best drawing I've done, and yet it was key to everything that kept me going with digital art. And it is a key part of the art journey, and kind of why I'm doing what I'm doing now. It was also key to introduce me to the technical side of digital art, and different processes that I may not have been used to up until this point. The most glaring form here is that it let me mess with opacity and lighting for the first time, which I really enjoyed. Eventually, after somehow ending up on ideas that improved this drawing, I kind of compromised with myself. I agreed that I would redraw it, but I wouldn't force it to be entirely the same. For an example of this, I would change the composition since the original didn't add anything and was more included since I wanted to draw the skirt before anything else. I would also let myself make it a redraw in concept. So I am redrawing the original, but I'm adding to the idea with stronger ideas that I have for it now and removing those that didn't exactly work in the original. If anything, I'm redrawing it in spirit. That's kind of how I've been thinking about it at the very least. With that being said though, what are those details that ended up changing? The first, of course, was the composition. See, no sketch I made felt right when I tried to make them a full body drawing like in the original, since the character was meant to be quite calm and neutral in a sense. I mean, I wasn't good at drawing emotion in 2021, and it is something that I am still working on to this day, as I maybe have a really bad habit of overlooking it 9 times out of 10. Yet, I want to say that it was definitely way worse when I first drew this drawing. It meant that a lot of my characters back then were somewhat calmer or stiller, even if that was done unintentionally. But I was going for a fairly simple pose, and a character where they may have been a calmer type, or maybe firmer, and not really want to mess around with their magic too much. This time, I favoured the idea of keeping the pose similar to the original, since, from noting down and evaluating the image, I knew that I would be changing a large portion of the imagery and the character. They would end up nearly unrecognisable with everything that I wanted to change. I knew that, in the end, I would have very few tethers to the original for this redraw, for various reasons, but I didn't want to overlook it, and I knew that I was working with ideas that I didn't want to change or sacrifice for the sake of maintaining that similarity. The pose, out of everything, was one of the few changes that I wanted to maintain and keep the same, though maybe slightly change it for the strength of the drawing. It also could stay, since I was trying to maintain the original feeling of the character, if that makes any sort of sense. I could really keep that neutrality and kind of tie in everything else from there. In addition to this tie though, a lot of the details would be small, something better seen up close, since I would add more to the overall outcome of the person if it wasn't so far away. This is why, very early on, I moved them closer to the make-believe camera and started to consider everything else that I could do for this figure, so that they're not just in the void or anything like the original. I don't hate the void, don't get me wrong, but it just felt wrong to leave it plain this time, where I am intending to show a bit of improvement from the original drawing, and that was one of the things I considered plain after so long. Originally, it was why I drew other versions with more characters before adding them all into a single file for some interest, and so the background made sense. Yet, on their own, things like this could be improved. Besides, the character has kind of a lot going on from the sketching phase alone, so a plain environment sort of was just too different to leave it. This is where I considered a few options of mine. The first was space and galaxy. I very faintly remember wanting to trial it with the original drawing, yet ultimately giving up and reverting back to the background it has. Originally, I was still getting used to it and everything, so a galaxy wasn't something I'd worked out just yet, and I wouldn't for a few more attempts. I could have continued that time, yet stopped as it wasn't working with the character anyway. This time has a very similar story. The galaxy conflicted a lot with the sketch details and the ideas I'd already settled on. The lights would have also been confusing, and a lot would have just been going on and been lost behind the veil anyway, which meant I never settled on the idea. It also meant that I was more than willing to literally turn to any other idea that wouldn't clash with the character like that one would. Besides, the palette of the character was too close to anything that the galaxy background may have used. This is then where I instead switched to the border idea. It was the idea that I settled on for the sketch, though, in all honesty, I wasn't entirely sold on it until the very end of the drawing, where I finally felt that it fit. And that was only after I added a subtle light behind the characters themselves, like in the original. In the sketching stages, I liked it a lot, the border, that is, and there was easily a lot of potential for what I could do with it. And the more I messed with it, the more ideas came together, and the more it kind of made it all more relevant to the idea. For example, I didn't just want to put a square around the entire image, since it wouldn't connect to space too well. But I also didn't want it to be too busy visually, that it overtook the entire thing. This was the issue with my first border. It was way too busy. It was like lines of a galaxy interweaving with each other, and small accents of stars and the moon as well across everything. If I continued with this one, it would clash as the lines often intersected with the drawing rather awkwardly, and it was clear that it just wasn't the most thought through idea. I mean, sensibly so, since I was just trying stuff, and I would have thought it a little bit more through if I'd kept it. But the point still stands anyway. It wouldn't have worked, so I looked at something a bit more solid. It is also worth noting that the border choice was still being thought about when I was thinking that this video would have been 2 other witches in it as well. I considered this detail to be something that I could do across them all to tie the set together, and, as part of this, wanted something that I could change to fit in the other elements as well. This is then where the word plate comes from in the process. It would have clearly denoted what my working theme was, and it would let me include text too in a very simple manner. I then ended up keeping the border when I moved away from the set idea, since at that point I was leaning towards the border staying slightly, and I felt that it added to this drawing too on its own. I suppose in a small way, it's another part of the redraw showing a slight improvement, since I wouldn't even consider including text when I first did this drawing. I didn't think it would have been able to incorporate it, or to incorporate text without it looking like a sticker. And I hadn't thought my drawings had room for it unless in very specific circumstances. Naturally, since then, I have included subtle links and done small amounts of work with text, but it still isn't something that I favour, so it only will keep a minor role. From that box, I had the frame too. I could simplify the line and add something to break it up a little in the more open areas, yet I could also keep the solid line if it was going to cover areas of the drawing, so it wasn't too busy. For example, the top corner was rather plain compared to everything else, and I had a lot of space to work with, so I could add the phases of the moon, and a kind of relation back to the theme at hand. The other corners worked well with a small circle too, as it had been a shape across their design in many spaces, so it fit in without looking too out of place, and it also didn't demand too much attention. Yet for the area next to places like the pendant of her hat, I could use a solid line since accenting anything there seemed too busy, and it would conflict with the hat's pendant. Yes, there are some areas like the left side of the image, where there are details in both the person and the frame, yet I don't mind them so much there since, at that point, I was leaning into the detail in this drawing and enjoying it. Plus, it didn't clash in the same way that the other side of the image had been, since the details over there were mostly the veil and the pendants hanging from the hat. Even then, none of the border covers these details too much, which was really my main classification for changing the border and reworking things in this area. So the busy look here got to stay since I really enjoyed it, which again is another change from since I did the original. I didn't really like the busy look before. I'll talk more about the details I changed though in a short while, kinda give them their own spotlight. Yet in terms of process, I actually argued with myself for a fair while when it came to the colour palette. See, I had the original and there wasn't anything terribly wrong with the palette, so to speak. It could be worked with, and this would be a bit closer to an accurate redraw if I kept with it. And there were merits to keeping the original palette too. I mean, dark blue is a space colour that I tie into it, and yellow is a good accent if I use it in the right way and think about it just that little bit more. I could centre the palette on that, and maybe, if needed with the new details, allow myself to include more colour to cover the details. And I still wouldn't have to stray too far even in saying all of that. Though the blue was a bit vibrant to be my first choice anymore, and it was far more vibrant than I would gravitate towards too. It also really isn't my first choice for a space witch anymore, since now I would instead lean more towards the purple that I used as an accent originally. Though even in that case, I would still maybe make it either brighter or darker respectively. At this point, I was still considering including a water witch in the set, and they would have clashed if I'd made it blue too. Yet even on their own, a purple ties more to mystery, which kind of fits space to me that little bit better if I had to assign them a certain colour. So I kind of had to choose which route to take. As you can see, the new palette won, and I am really glad that it did. The first reason I changed the palette to something new is because I wanted to move away from the yellow as well. I know that saying that is somewhat unusual for myself, since it is my usual and go-to pairing for yellow and purple. I mean, they're complementary colours, so they always go well together. Well, most of the time they go well together. Though this time it kind of took away from the character. In the original, I used yellow to try and mimic gold for the accessories and the bracelets on the character. I focused on the yellow working with the blue, and I didn't consider the character's theme so much. I mean, space is silver. It isn't gold. So my first change had been making yellow a smaller part of the overall palette, in favour of this being a silver character before anything else. My next main reason had been since the original palette's colours were just a little bit off what I would currently go for. The blue is vibrant on its own, and I remember it was quite hard to convincingly pair with anything, which is why I used a vibrant purple and yellow with it, just to try and make something that worked. I wasn't willing to make it darker since I wasn't aware of what I could have done to shade it back then, and I also didn't want it to fade into the background. Yet I probably still could have made it a few shades darker and found a bit more of a middle ground even back then. This time, I wanted to start with a bit of a darker base between the blue and the purple range, and that was so that I could then accent it with more vibrant colours. That was then the final reason I really had to change it. This time I had more things in the drawing and more items to colour and include, which would also require a wider palette to make it work without overlapping anything and relying on shading. I also had a want to include some stronger and lighter colours to the piece where I could, and this was so that I could then tie in the vibrant colours where relevant, and this was since I do associate space with more than just darkness these days. As I worked out how to draw galaxies, I realised that it used a lot more of lighter blues and purples with various glowing effects put into the mix. And these colours gave me more movement room in the palette, since they would also contrast the darker tones included fairly well compared to the older one. It really came down to what I would want in the end. The original image is very dark to look at, and the colours don't help it. I wasn't as familiar with drawing digitally, so shading didn't help the palette either, and even then, I would have only been able to do so much before it was just a dark image minus the start of the lighting effects that I would later look into more. With the new one, I wanted it to stand out that bit more. I wanted there to be light to it and a sense of contrast that wouldn't really rely solely on how the image was going to be shaded. With all of that said, let's now look at the actual details that I changed, and kind of go over why these things were how they are. The first up on this list is the hat, since this certainly changed a lot. I mean, comparing the old and new design equals two entirely different designs, since it is quite important to the drawing overall, and yet, in the original, was one of the first things that I tore apart to work out what needed to be changed and what could be kept. In all honesty, nothing really stayed, and I really only aimed to keep the spirit of things in this case in particular. The first thing to change was the shape of the hat. I knew that it would stay big, and I knew that I would keep the tilt, with it falling almost to the side in terms of how it sits. Yet in the original, the shape was done to keep it on the page, and to show it as a big hat, yet despite it being so important, I wasn't willing to move the character or alter anything about how I had the canvas set up to actually facilitate it. The hat was important to the idea of a witch, and really one of the few details that showed that I was drawing a witch in particular. Though I still ended up cutting off the top of the hat in favour of showing a long skirt that ended up adding nothing. It curved inwards on itself to keep it on the page, so that I could add the pendant I had in mind and little else. This time, I could factor in the layout to the hat and the composition, and I knew to give myself space at the top of the page for it, since it is important to the design. This let me shift it slightly differently too. The reason I changed it from the curling downwards to curling outwards was simply for overlaps. When drawing the character this time, I ended up adding the slightest of angles to them, and with how it is now, the hat's point would have folded down and sat behind the hat's brim, which visually would grow quite confusing too. It also makes better use of the space in the end as well with it tilting outwards. I mean, the original design is almost afraid to use up the full page. It doesn't want to branch out, and it doesn't really use the space to its fullest potential. This was something that I wanted to change, and the hat subtly did that for me. Alongside all of this, the changed hat shape makes sense for the pendant to change too. It hangs better from this shape, and if I kept it in the original, then the pendant would have been entirely obscured or more visual noise behind the character. This time, I added it hanging to the side, and kind of changed the design of it too. The first change was ways to connect it to the hat by adding at least some implication of a thread wrapping around the hat, as if it is there by a real connection between them rather than just magic. I imagine it to be sewn down as well so that the thread didn't shift or fall off, but that wasn't as important as the actual physical joint was. From there, I also wanted to change the pendant's contents and what actually made up the design. I mean, the original had no tie to space. Let's just be honest about that for a moment and not try to kid ourselves. They were strange shapes that I tied together because I wasn't sure what else to do for it, and I didn't want to just use a diamond. I didn't even think of a star since they were all uneven and wonky when I relied on random and plain shapes, and none of these seemed to add anything to it. It had to change, in other words. I had the thread included, and I added that curved diamond shape in the new version that is often used as a star shape. I then topped it off with some circles as they tied into the rest of the design, as this is a repetitive theme for her. And then I finished off all of this pendant with the crescent moon, as this shape at least ties into space. And it is a very space-themed pendant. Besides, with how the hat sits, these details were clearly to their side and hanging in a way that wasn't too obstructive with the rest of the design, which I also strongly valued. The final detail of the hat itself that I changed was the ribbon on it. In the original, I added some sort of pin to it and gave it ruffles and all sorts of detailing when, again, I now don't really see what it adds. I think, if memory serves me well, I simply wanted to draw the ruffle since I saw something showing a good way of doing it, and I simply wanted to test it out to see if it was actually something that was going to work or not. So I added it, and I liked it, and I kept it for the original. In the new versions though, they simply had to change. The ruffles weren't fitting with the hat anymore, and I had already used the moon pattern for the pendant, and the original pin on the hat added very little, so it could be afforded to change. This means that I kept it as a simple ribbon. The veil was busy, and there was already a lot going on in this area of the design, so the pin just simply wasn't needed. I at most added 2 strips of fabric that looked like the ribbon itself, so that the area wasn't too plain compared to anything else. But it didn't compete or stand out against everything else, and it simply blended in with it all, which is what I intended for it to do. Changing these details did end up with a hat design that I much preferred. Besides, it gave me a good base for the changes I made to the veil, which is the next detail that I want to discuss here. Now, the veil of the original hat isn't much, even though I meant it to be like the character's main thing, and the aspect that I kind of put in the most work into as I based the character around it. This entire drawing originally was a test for drawing transparent things, and how I would go about that in a digital process, so it was pretty key. But it ended up incredibly plain, even though I did try to decorate it. The first thing that had to go was the strange bumps around the hat, as I wasn't sure if that was meant to be part of the hat, or lace, or who knows what. I also had to remove the things connecting to them since they weren't the pendants I wanted. I intended for them to be hanging details, yet then I ended up drawing them like they were printed onto the fabric at the last minute. Not to mention that they are quite clearly avoiding the edges of the fabric where they would have to turn and bend, since I didn't want to draw the pattern around with the fabric since I wasn't too sure how it would have worked. These were easily my first changes. I removed the lace altogether as, again, it added nothing and I couldn't tell what it was supposed to be, which told me enough that it wasn't too important. As for the pendants themselves, well, they had to be more noticeable and more of a feature. They needed more than I originally gave them, since they could have been so much cooler than I originally did it. You can likely see by now in the video that they are one of the main details in the character, and I used them to make the space theme all that more apparent. Instead of keeping the old patterns that didn't make the most sense, I decided to string together stars of 2 kinds, the 5-pointed yellow ones and the 4-pointed strange diamond-shaped ones, to keep it from looking too repetitive than if I kept to a single type of star. I also included the crescent moons and the circle beads that really brought it all together. The moon's inclusion is pretty obvious as to why I did it. I don't really need to patronise anyone by explaining why a space character features the moon. Yet the round beads were included as a neutral option in the pendants and in her design. The shape is like the moon and planets, so it makes sense why she would feature the shape in a few areas. But I shaded them simply to keep the pendants and such being too busy, that they didn't really match the rest of the design. If I made it more planets or too overly detailed, then everything could have been a bit more out of balance, and I didn't want that. I wanted them to stand out, to be the detail that they could have been before, but not look out of place before anything else. I knew I would already be arguing with parts of them that would maybe clash or interrupt the area below, so I didn't want to be battling with the details of them as well, or making them planets. I mean, when I made them planets and tried to go down that route, it introduced a few too many colours that otherwise weren't in the palette, and it didn't sit right with everything else as it just drew too much attention. So it's pretty obvious that if I wanted to do that, I would have needed touches of the colours in other places on her design as well, which would have been massively widening the palette. Yet, in saying all of this, the pendants are still one of my favourite details in the piece overall. It added to the hat and the veil, and it almost completed the area and the idea that I had in my head that this image could have been before. These weren't the only changes though. For the veil itself, I changed it from grey to a gradient, and I tore the ends of it so it was more frayed. The colour shift was the main thing. I made it blue and purple so that it fit with the new palette a lot better, and it stood out that bit more overall. The original grey one was almost negligible over the character, except a small amount of texture and detail, so I wanted this one to fit in a bit more. Besides, I remember wanting the original to be a gradient too, yet not doing it since I wasn't sure how it looked when I shaded it, and I thought that the colours just didn't fit the palette that I had in the original. I mean, it didn't, as I know that much. But it still meant that this time I had the idea to include it like I originally wanted it to be. Plus, this time the blue and the purple are more vibrant, and I liked it more for this palette anyway. It kept it all bright, and it drew attention that little bit better. The torn edge was then a change that I made on a whim. I liked how it looked, and I thought that it suited this idea for the character a bit more than something refined and trimmed in lace. Yes, they were meant to be a more passive character, yet with magic and such, it could be argued that it would wear with time and fray. If not, then it also sat better with me being this route, since I don't think of space as straight and neat lines anymore. This just fit that little bit better. Moving on though, I did change their face quite a bit. The main debate that I had, however, had been their eyes. I wasn't sure if I would keep them as an abyss or include a lilac pupil to them to make them more human. In the end, I liked the abyss better, since it read more as a redraw by keeping this detail, and it also let me see how I had improved in this regard alone. It also kept the same atmosphere to the character, tying their being into space rather than them simply being someone who looked like it or who likes dressing for space. Again though, it was the same logic as redrawing the spirit of the original. If I'd suddenly made them very human, then it didn't kind of sit right, and that was an entirely new idea. So I kept the eyes. Their eyes reflect the element, as they are a witch of space, and it fits the original spirit, as I kind of feel like I would have otherwise lost it if I'd kept going with the pupil idea. I have changed a lot, so where I can, I wanted to keep the details that I didn't take an issue with anymore. In saying all of that, one thing I did alter was the mark on the character's cheek. Originally, it was a strange collection of marks and shapes that were purely done to look unusual and to add interest to a character. And it was just a strange collection of marks. And it didn't really expand on anything. They meant nothing, and even when drawing them, they had no particular significance overall. It just looked unusual. So this time I wanted to keep the spirit of it, yet make it somewhat more thematic. The symbol became freckles under their eye, and I kind of made it look like the Big Dipper constellation. It was something subtle that is seen when really picking apart the design, yet it was something that makes me smile, and the tie into the theme of her original skirt into the new design, since the original design of the skirt was something that I thought about for the first time around, and I kind of wanted to acknowledge that now. It's why some of the other constellations from the skirt were moved into freckles along their arms. And those shapes are a bit harder to make out, but again, that makes me smile because you have to kind of look for that. Again, these are definitely by far more subtle than they were in the original design. Yet, they're details there to make me smile, and that I can quite happily show to my space friend to make them smile too, as it's tiny but it's there, and it is a little nod to the original. In the original, they're very apparent, and it's more obvious that they don't bend with the fabric before anything else. I mean, when I first saw the drawing, yes, I liked the constellation detail, but it distracted me how much that it didn't move with the skirt before anything else. Beyond this though, I did try to keep the face pretty similar. I mean, the hair is almost unrecognisable. In the original, I didn't care about it. I didn't want to draw it, and I thought that I couldn't do anything cool or fun with it since the veil was in the way, and I wasn't sure how I would respond or work in those cases. I picked a random colour close enough to the palette and called it done, and I called it a day since it was just there. This time, I actually made it fun. It may look familiar to something I've done before. If you have seen my Dreams and Nightmares series, short as it may be at the moment, there is this dream that I drew of a woman lying in the river that I discussed, and that image is one that I printed off for my wall because I quite enjoyed it. So I see it fairly often, and the idea is fairly present in my mind and the techniques I used for it. The hair in that one is drawn to look as if it's floating in the water around them, all wavy and moving like hair would in water. So, long story short, I figured that I could use this idea to make the hair look as if it is waving and floating almost, or moving at the very least. My idea was to make it look like gravity was less effective on it, or that it was responding to the magic in her hands. It may not come across like it, but I had more thought to everything, and I enjoyed it that bit more than before. I saw the hair this time as a feature, not just something to sit there and be looked at and overlooked like before. I think before I added hair as an obligation more than because I wanted to. I also this time put more consideration into the colour of the hair, and the blue was part of the palette I liked since I figured I could make it look more like the skies that little bit. The back is darker blue, shaded normally, yet I added stronger highlights to it so that these strands stood out. The fringe is lighter like the day's sky, yes, but it is shaded in a similar manner. I mean, the hair still isn't meant to be the main detail. I still thought about it more than a few seconds though, which I'm quite happy with. It's why, as a tiny little nod to the skies, I added dots of light across it and around it as if their hair had small and tiny stars in it too, without taking away from the pendants and anything around them. You'll notice that's a theme by now. Small details done to purely make me happy. It was still a balance though. I wanted the hair to be more part of the character, yet not overpower the things around it. I like to think that there is this balance too. But moving on to the next detail, the character's original dress had no thought behind it. I'll admit that straight out of the gate. I know I sound harsh to my past self, but I drew what was easy at the time. It worked. I mean, I know why I did it. I used the drawing to get used to digital art rather than trying to progress anything else like clothes. But it is still true that I went with the easy route and little more. So this time I wanted to change it. My first change naturally was the neckline. A high neck was done to avoid drawing that part of the person and having to shade it. Yet this time I wanted the V-neck to lead towards the planet pin, since I knew that I would be including very few of these across their design, and it felt like an important place to put one. I mean, in the end, it was the only pin in the design, and the other planet was the magic, which I thought worked out really well. I otherwise thought the neckline suited the flowy sleeves that I knew that I wanted. In the original, I wanted to make the sleeves flow, yet then ended up with quite structured sleeves that wouldn't move too much since I didn't give it the right shape in any sense. Naturally, now, I could fix this, since the flowy sleeves were another subtle reference to very little gravity. I mean, I really wanted this character to look like their clothes would have motion. Like when they moved, it would twirl and float almost, and just give that little bit of a nod towards space. It should have looked light for the most part, and these sleeves were a small part that I could include as an improvement. I tried originally, I did. Yet I didn't commit to the curves needed to convey a lighter sleeve of more motion. I also didn't really understand back then how to kind of tell or show fabric weight in drawing, so it didn't really end up the way I wanted it to. As for the belt in the design, I simplified it a lot. Before, there was just too much going on for a belt that was meant to be covered by magic and their arms anyway. I mean, I purposely avoided placing the arm where it would cover anything of importance when the belt didn't need that much detail. This time is double that since there is so much going on around it, and the arms cover far more for it. I can imply it dips down, I can imply straight lines on it too. Yet I didn't need the pin on it and the patterns or many layers of lining that I included before for a section that would be covered, and really should have been covered more than I originally made it. If I had it more open, I could add something, but it simply wasn't needed this time. I know I've skipped over the belt fairly quickly, yet there isn't much to say on it since it really wasn't important at the end of the day. The final detail of the dress that changed was the skirt. See, I wanted to keep the shape of it to the first one, and I also knew that I could do less with it since I had removed the lower half in this composition. Yet I could still do things with it. So I added an implied layer of pleats over the lower skirt. This was for both visual interest and other thoughts to it as well. See, I wanted layers in the skirt since space is big, and the layers would usually make a skirt have more presence, so that, if I was drawing the whole skirt, it may have been a bit larger than the original. I also thought that the pleats would twirl well, whilst also complementing the darker base of the skirt that here is mostly hidden. The style of the overlayer also gave me the ability to shade the skirt with a bit more interest to it as well, without having to worry about designs of the lower layer, or simply hiding it. The pleats were also a very slight and subtle tie to the original. See, I removed them from the hat, and I also removed a lot of other lace detailing, so it felt right to include a small but very present nod to it elsewhere, even if it is mostly covered again in the end. Finally is the magic. There isn't much to say on this other than the fact that I made it more space related, and I actually gave it more thought as to what they would be using their magic to do. Maybe thought about what their icon would actually be in this respect. A planet ties to space more than the orb did, and I also now understand the art program more to include better lighting around it to make it stand out as it should. Not to mention, I'm also able to somewhat understand how the light would respond to the environment and the things around it. I only say somewhat since I do blur and make up some parts where the lights would have been coming from off the page as well. But for the magic at the very least, I know to add the purple to the hands to actually include it in the environment and to make it look more like it belongs. I could also use it to add more effects to make the planet more convincing as a focal point. Though, in saying that, we are coming up on time here. I know I brushed over that final point, but I really didn't realise how close to the end we were for a moment here. So, overall, I do definitely see an improvement between the two, though I still like them both. I don't think I'll ever hate the original. Yes, the original is imperfect, and it has faults, especially faults that I've spent this entire video tearing apart. But in all of it, this drawing was a key part of my art journey, and I remember making it and being so proud of it. It was the first one and the first digital thing that I was proud to show people, and that made me want to continue this alongside everything else as well. The new one is something I like for the moment, as it shows me how I have improved, even if this drawing too isn't perfect. But that too is an improvement. I had a few times in this video where I kept trying to fix something in the image, and it just made it worse each time. So I kinda knew I had to do my best and leave it, since I was growing frustrated. If I came back to it, I would, and if I didn't, then I wouldn't. But the image still looks complete, even with those sections, and it is one of my current new favourites as well. So with all of that being said, thank you so much for watching and for sticking until the end. I hope you have a wonderful day and week, and I will see you next time. But for now, goodbye.